in the silent ruins of forgotten temples, in the wind-blown dust of northern India's abandoned cities, something waits. Not a treasure, not a scroll, but something older, deeper, carried not in hand, but in blood. This is not just the story of a dynasty. It's the story of a living code, buried not in tombs, but in the veins of millions. The Gurjara Pratiharas, rulers of Kannauj, defenders of India's cultural frontier, may have fallen more than 1,000 years ago. Their palaces may have crumbled, but their legacy might still be alive, written in the double helix of human DNA. We know their names: Nagabhata, Bhoja, Mahendrapala. But who were they before they became emperors? Where did they come from? How did a people so elusive in origin rise to defy Arab invasions, rival two great empires, and reshape the Indian subcontinent's political heart? This is where the mystery begins. Ancient Chinese pilgrims wrote of a kingdom called Chalo, Gujara, with a capital near present-day Rajasthan. Indian inscriptions refer to a fierce clan named Pratihara, claiming descent from Lakshmana, the younger brother of Lord Rama, the eternal gatekeeper of divine justice. But these aren't just royal tales or political myths. These are the early signals of an identity still not fully understood. Were the Gurjaras native to India? Or were they outsiders, warriors from the steppe, shaped by wind and war, who entered through the northwest and carved their name into Indian history? Some scholars have traced linguistic trails linking Gurjara to Central Asian groups like the Khazars. Others believe the term was born in India itself, rooted in land, not blood. And yet, across sources, one truth emerges. They arrived suddenly, decisively, like a fire lit from nowhere, dominating territories that had seen the fall of the Guptas and the chaos of Hun invasions. The name Pratihara means doorkeeper. But they weren't guarding temples. They were guarding India itself. When the Caliphate sent armies eastward from Sind, it was the Gurjara Pratiharas who stood as a wall, halting the tide of conquest that had swept through Persia and Afghanistan. And yet, for all their strength, their origins remain a riddle. No ancient manuscripts spell it out. No buried royal remains have yet given us DNA to test. All we have are echoes. Echoes in surnames. Echoes in legends. And maybe, just maybe, echoes in genes. What if the answers lie not in the broken temples of Rajasthan, but in the living blood of herders in Kashmir, farmers in Punjab, or nomads in Gujarat? What if Gujara blood didn't disappear, it simply dispersed? The story we are about to unfold isn't just about a dynasty. It's about what they left behind, and where those traces might be hiding today. Because sometimes the dead don't vanish. They migrate. What if I told you that one of India's greatest empires may have been built by complete strangers? No, not invaders in the way we imagine, not looters or raiders, but something harder to define. People who arrived from somewhere beyond the known maps and yet became the defenders of the land they entered. This is the unsettling, electrifying mystery behind the Gurjara Pratiharas. Their name appears like a bolt of lightning in 7th century records. No slow rise, no gradual evolution, just a sudden, sharp ascent to power. One moment, India was fragmented in the aftermath of the Guptas. The next, the Pratiharas were holding Kannauj and staring down the might of Arab armies. But where did they come from? Some historians think they were born from the very soil of Rajasthan and Gujarat, indigenous clans who rose when the time was right. Others aren't so sure. They see echoes of the steppe in their titles, hints of the Khazar or Huna in their rise, in their military discipline, in their sudden appearance. Could the name Gurjara itself be a clue? Some argue it sounds suspiciously close to Khazar, the powerful Turkic tribe that ruled across Central Asia. Could there be a forgotten link between them? A migration we never properly traced? Here's something strange. Texts from that era often list Gurjaras alongside the Huns, not as enemies, but in the same breath. Were they allies, siblings in conquest? Or did the Gurjaras emerge from the ashes of Hun rule, taking their tactics, even their bloodlines, and forging something new? The legends complicate things further. One version of their origin says they came from a fire pit, quite literally. The Agnivansha myth describes how certain Rajput clans, including the Pratiharas, were born from sacred fire at Mount Abu. But was that a literal story, or a metaphor for political rebirth? A ritual fiction to legitimize foreign roots within a rigid caste system? Because think about it. If a foreign group wanted to rise in India, they needed more than power. They needed identity. They needed myth. Claiming descent from Lakshmana, Rama's loyal brother, wasn't just spiritual branding. It was a masterstroke in cultural assimilation. A way to say, we belong, even if they hadn't at first. The inscriptions confirm it. In 837 CE, a stone carving at Mandir proudly declares a Pratihara ancestor as the doorkeeper to Rama himself. Later, Bhoja's own inscriptions echo that lineage again. But here's the twist. Rama and Lakshmana are figures of divine legend. If you're reaching for that kind of ancestry, it might mean you had none in the land you ruled. Not yet. So ask yourself, why would a ruling dynasty go to such lengths to tie themselves to myth, unless the reality of their past was either lost or inconvenient? And what about the land itself? Was Gurjara originally a place or a people? The lines are blurred. Some ancient texts use it to describe a kingdom. Others seem to use it like a tribal name. Even the Chinese monk Xuanzang described a kingdom called Qiu, likely Gurjara, with its capital at Beenmul. Was this a centralized state? Or just the first marker of a migrating group beginning to settle? You can still hear it today. Gujjar, Gujjar, Gujranwala, Gujarat. The name endured, even as the empire crumbled. That doesn't happen unless the people stayed. So, were the Gujjars born in India? Or did they arrive and become Indian by choice? The truth is, maybe they were both. Maybe their power came not from pure lineage, but from synthesis, from the ability to blend, adapt, and rewrite their story, until even history couldn't tell where they truly began. And maybe that's what made them so dangerous to their enemies, because they weren't tied to one identity. They could become whatever the moment demanded: foreigners, natives, fireborn warriors, mythic gatekeepers. Ask yourself, if your roots were a weapon, would you reveal them? Or would you bury them so deep that only your blood remembered the truth? Let's say the palaces are gone, the inscriptions weathered, the empire dissolved into dust. But what if the dynasty didn't vanish at all? What if it just kept walking among us, an ordinary people, unaware of the extraordinary past coded in their blood? The Gurjara Pratiharas may have ruled more than 1,000 years ago, but their story might not be locked in the past. It could be living inside the veins of a community still spread across the northern Indian subcontinent. They're called Gurjars, or Gujjars. You've probably heard the name. Pastoralists, soldiers, nomads, settled communities in India, Pakistan, even Afghanistan. But what connects them to a vanished royal house? Here's where it gets scientific. When geneticists began sampling DNA from Gurjar populations, they weren't looking for royalty. But what they found startled them. Deep inside the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, they kept finding the same signal, a powerful presence of haplogroup R1A. Now, R1A isn't rare. It's found in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and across northern India. But the concentration of R1A in Gujjar men, especially in regions like Jammu, wasn't just average. It was dominant. What does that mean? It means their male lineage echoes the same patterns we see in Indo-European migrations, those ancient movements of people from the steppes of Central Asia, who once swept across continents shaping languages, cultures, and perhaps dynasties. But R1A was only the beginning. Other haplogroups also appeared. L, linked to the Indus Valley, J2, connected to the Fertile Crescent and early West Asian farmers. H, a signal of ancient South Asian roots. The Gujjars weren't a single thread. They were a tapestry, stitched from every direction. And on the maternal side, that's where it gets even more interesting. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to children, revealed a less discussed marker, M30F. Not common, not widespread, but showing up again and again in Gurjar samples, especially in Jammu and Ladakh. A hidden maternal signature, silent for centuries, until science brought it to light. But here's the question that still haunts us. Is this really the blood of kings? The truth is, DNA doesn't care for thrones. It carries no memory of crowns or conquests. It just tells us who shares ancestry with whom, who walked together, married together, migrated together. But when we overlay these genetic patterns on the map of the old Pratihara Empire, something begins to shift. Gurjars in Jammu show genetic closeness, not just with local populations, but with Pashtun in Afghanistan and Sindhis in Pakistan. That's a cross-border echo of movement, migration, intermarriage, shared roots. Could this be the trail of the same people who once rode from western India to guard Kannauj? Some would say yes. Even more compelling? Despite being neighbors, Gurjars from Gujarat, the region thought to bear the very name Gujara, often don't share the same genetic profile. It's as if the name stayed behind, but the people moved on. You start to wonder, what if the Pratiharas weren't just kings of a place, but kings of a migrating identity? Carriers of a bloodline that didn't remain rooted in stone, but flowed across regions, reshaping itself and surviving in flesh. The genetic clues are there, in the percentages, in the patterns, in the way a community today, often overlooked, might unknowingly carry the legacy of India's last great Hindu empire. But if that's true, why don't they know it? Why aren't the Gujars seen as descendants of kings? Why has no modern political movement fully claimed this legacy with the force it deserves? Maybe because history doesn't always hand down its truth in straight lines. Maybe because some dynasties weren't preserved in scrolls, they were preserved in people. And if so, the real question becomes, could you be one of them? What if the DNA of a lost empire was scattered not in one tomb, but across half a continent? This is not a story about monuments. This is a story about movement, about people who refuse to stay still, whose footsteps shaped the genetics of an entire region. The Gurjara Pratiharas weren't just rulers. They were migrants. And their legacy wasn't just political. It was biological. Now imagine this. You're standing on a windswept ridge in Afghanistan. The mountains are dry. The rivers barely flow. And hundreds of years ago, a caravan of families, warriors, priests, herders, begins moving. Eastward. Always east. Why? Maybe it was climate, drought swallowing crops. Maybe it was war, the collapse of another empire pushing them forward. Or maybe it was ambition, the need to find a new place and make it their own. They passed through the Indus Valley, where ancient cities had once thrived. They follow river routes into Punjab, then fanned out across Rajasthan, Gujarat, and the Gangetic Plains. They don't move like an army. They move like a wave. And with every stop, they blend. The DNA supports it. Gujjar groups across northern India carry markers linked to Central Asia, West Asia, and ancient South Asia, not in fragments, but in patterns. This isn't coincidence. It's migration, etched into genomes. But migrations don't just mix blood, they alter identity. That's why Gujars in Pakistan sometimes resemble Sindhis or Pashtun, while their counterparts in India lean closer to Jats or Rajputs. Same name, same ancestral memory, but genetically tuned by region. And here's where the trail gets even more bizarre. Despite centuries of settlement in Gujarat, the very region whose name echoes Gurjara, many modern Gujars that show less genetic similarity to their namesakes in Rajasthan or Jammu. It's as if the original wave of Gurjara migration passed through, leaving a name behind, but taking its genes elsewhere. So what were they looking for? Power? Perhaps. The Pratiharas did build an empire, but their bloodlines suggest something older than politics, a survival instinct, a pattern of adaptation, herding cultures, nomadic pulses, people who were never meant to stay in one place for too long. Even British colonial records noted it. In the 19th century, irrigation reforms in Punjab triggered yet another Gurjar migration northward. Not a conquest, just another bend in the river of movement they followed for over 1,000 years. So what happens when a community moves for centuries, across empires, terrains, and cultures? You get genetic complexity. You get blurred lines. You get a dynasty whose true identity isn't written in history books. It's scattered in bones, in blood, in living people who may never know who they really descend from. And if that's true, what does that make history? Is it a fixed story carved into stone, or a moving pattern that we're only now beginning to decode? Because here's the uncomfortable thought. The farther they moved, the harder it became to trace them. But that doesn't mean they disappeared. It means they survived. And their survival isn't locked in time. It's all around us, woven into genetics, surnames, dialects, even forgotten migration routes. This isn't just the story of where the Gurjara Pratiharas ruled. It's the story of how far they ran, how deep they sank, and how much of them still lives on. Power isn't just taken on the battlefield. Sometimes it's built behind closed doors. Because what if the real secret to a dynasty's survival wasn't how many wars they won, but who they chose to marry? In the case of the Gurjara Pratiharas, the walls of the palace didn't just keep enemies out. They kept the bloodline in. Now picture this. You're in a royal court. Gold, banners, advisors whispering strategies. But one conversation keeps repeating behind the curtain. Who will the prince marry? Not for love, not for alliance, but for preservation, for purity. Because in early medieval India, marriage wasn't just a social arrangement. It was a genetic decision. The caste system wasn't just about roles. It was about controlling DNA. And if you ruled a kingdom, your blood had to reflect your divine status. You couldn't marry down. Sometimes, you couldn't marry outside your clan at all. So what happens when a royal family keeps its marriages locked inside narrow circles for centuries? You get a genetic phenomenon known as endogamy, marrying within your group. It limits outside influence. It freezes certain genetic traits in place, and over time, it creates something unusual, a population with statistically lower genetic diversity than their neighbors. Guess what? That's exactly what we find in some Gurjar subgroups today. Studies show that Gujars from regions like Ladakh and Jammu display lower mitochondrial and Y-chromosomal variation than surrounding ethnic groups. In simple terms, their gene pool is tighter, more concentrated. Why does that matter? Because that pattern doesn't just happen on its own. It suggests deliberate, sustained isolation, likely rooted in centuries of caste-linked or clan-linked marital rules. It's not just a modern practice either. Inscriptions from the time of the Gurjara Pratiharas mention the presence of Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and other caste roles. But they also hint at restricted marriages, strategic unions designed to consolidate power, not spread it. And it wasn't just about caste. If your dynasty traced its lineage to Lakshmana, the divine gatekeeper, you had to act like divine blood ran in your veins. That meant no scandal, no dilution, no room for error. The result? Over time, their genetic signature may have become unusually distinct, not because they were biologically special, but because they were controlled, engineered, guarded. But here's where it gets deeply personal. These same marriage customs, once used to preserve power, are still practiced in many Gurjar communities today. Generations of arranged marriages within tight community lines have kept certain genetic traits circulating. Even now, in villages across North India, who you marry is still about who your people are. And while modern science frowns on genetic isolation, history tells a more complicated tale. Because without those strict practices, maybe the Pratihara legacy would have faded. Maybe the dynasty would have dissolved into other lineages, lost to time. Instead, they left behind a faint echo, not in archives, but in the repetitive structure of certain gene groups, still measurable, still traceable. It's a chilling idea that the politics of blood, decisions made in candlelit halls centuries ago, are still shaping the bodies of people alive right now. So the next time someone says caste is just tradition, ask them this. What if it's also a fossil? A fossil made of DNA, passed down not because of choice, but because of royal fear? Every empire tells a story, but some write legends so powerful, they blur the line between history and illusion. The Gurjara Pratiharas weren't just warriors. They were storytellers, architects of myth. And the greatest illusion they ever built wasn't a temple, it was their own identity. Ask yourself, why would a ruling dynasty, with armies and land under their feet, need to claim descent from gods? Because power alone isn't enough. In a land as old and layered as India, political strength had to come with sacred legitimacy. And no lineage carried more divine weight than the bloodline of Lord Rama. So the Pratiharas claimed Lakshmana, Rama's younger brother, as their ancestor. Not casually, repeatedly, in royal inscriptions, in public declarations, in court poems. And why Lakshmana? Because Lakshmana wasn't just a prince. He was the Pratihari, the gatekeeper, the one who stood at the threshold between the divine and the mortal. By adopting that name, the dynasty wasn't just claiming descent, they were claiming a role, a cosmic responsibility. It was brilliant. It was bold. It was calculated. You see, the Gurjaras had a problem. No clear origin. No ancient dynasty to lean on. No epic mention. They rise suddenly in the 7th century, out of the political fog after the Gupta's collapse. No one knows exactly where they came from, and that's dangerous in a world where origin equals status. So they reached into mythology and built themselves a backstory. But was it just a convenient lie, or something deeper? Because here's where things get strange. Some accounts, like the Agnavancha legend, describe their emergence from a sacrificial fire pit on Mount Abu. Yes, a fire. Not a battlefield. Not a royal bloodline. A literal creation ritual. Alongside 3 other Rajput clans. Born not from conquest, but from flame. Of course, historians today don't take the legend literally. But think about the symbolism. A group possibly of foreign or mixed origin, entering a rigid caste system, needs legitimacy. And what better way to gain instant divine status than to be created by the gods themselves? The Agnavancha story wasn't just myth. It was social technology. It allowed a new warrior class, possibly born from old tribal groups, Hunar remnants, or Central Asian migrants, to rise as Kshatriyas. And once the story took root, it spread, passed down through bardic poetry, etched into stone, taught to future kings as divine truth. But here's the twist modern genetics adds to the puzzle. When scientists analyzed Gujjar and Rajput genomes, they noticed an interesting pattern. While both groups share deep South Asian ancestry, Rajputs tend to show slightly more steppe-related genetic signals, the same signals linked to Indo-European expansion. But Gujars, particularly those in Rajasthan and Jammu, display a higher Zagrosian component, DNA connected to ancient West Asian farming populations, with minimal steppe influence. So what does that mean? It means the groups that today claim shared ancestry, the fire-born Rajputs and the Gujjar clans, might have diverged genetically, but at some point in the past, they were likely part of the same evolving identity, the same crucible of cultural mixing and social elevation. This isn't just speculation. Studies suggest that some Rajput lineages may have branched off from the Gurjara base, as certain subclans gained land, recognition, or royal favor. They began identifying as distinct, elite Rajputs. So the myth of divine origin wasn't a mask. It was a bridge, a way for scattered tribes and warrior families to step into power while rewriting their past along the way. And maybe that's the real genius of the Pratiharas. They didn't just conquer territories. They conquered perception. They mastered the art of becoming indigenous, even if parts of their story came from far beyond India's borders. So now the question isn't whether their myth was true. The question is, why did it work so well? And how many other dynasties, right now, owe their existence to legends we've never questioned? We live in an age where we can extract DNA from a 40,000-year-old bone, where ancient genomes are reconstructed from frozen Siberian corpses and Neolithic skulls. But despite all this, we still don't know, with certainty, what the Gurjara Pratiharas actually looked like genetically. Why? Because the answers we're chasing are hidden in the one place science hasn't reached yet, their graves. For a dynasty that ruled northern India for over 300 years, there's a stunning absence of physical remains that can be directly linked to them. No royal tombs. No burial grounds confirmed by inscriptions. No skeletons confidently attributed to the ruling class of Kannauj. This isn't just frustrating. It's a black hole in Indian genetic history. The biggest roadblock? India's climate. In much of the subcontinent, the intense heat and humidity act like acid on ancient DNA. It decomposes faster. Bones become brittle. Even when remains are found, the genetic material inside is often so degraded that it crumbles before it can be sequenced. Compare that with regions like Europe or Central Asia, where dry caves or permafrost preserve DNA like a time capsule. That's why we know more about a 5,000-year-old herder from Kazakhstan than we do about a 1,200-year-old emperor from Kannauj. But there's another problem. Even when we do find ancient DNA in India, as researchers have begun to do, the samples are rarely tied to named dynasties. We can detect population movements, migrations, admixtures, but we can't say, this was Mahira Boja's cousin, or this skull belonged to a Pratihara queen. Without that direct link, we're left chasing shadows, which brings us to the modern workaround, using the DNA of communities believed to be descended from or connected to the dynasty. It's a smart approach, but it's not perfect, because in over 1,000 years, so much can change. Wars, famines, migrations, marriages, gene flow, isolation, integration. The Gujjara bloodline, if it ever existed as a distinct genetic thread, may have been diluted, expanded, or absorbed into dozens of modern populations. And even then, there's the risk of confusion between name and ancestry. Just because someone today carries the name Gurjara doesn't mean their lineage is untouched from the 9th century. Social identities evolve, caste shift, communities rebrand. In medieval India, upward mobility sometimes meant adopting a noble name or a legend, regardless of blood. So what we're left with is a paradox. We have strong circumstantial evidence, linguistic roots, migration patterns, genetic clusters in specific Gujjar populations. But we don't have a smoking gun, the royal bone, the confirmatory genome, the direct biological signature of the Pratihara court. Yet, because that might change. Just recently, ancient DNA was successfully extracted from a 4,500-year-old skeleton at Rakhigarhi, once thought impossible in Indian conditions. Technology is catching up. Precision tools like next-generation sequencing and ultra-short DNA fragment capture are pushing through barriers that once seemed unbreakable. The only thing missing now is discovery. A well-preserved burial, a forgotten grave in Rajasthan, a lost Pratihara temple site holding the bones of kings. When that happens, and it will happen, we might finally answer the question we've been chasing. Did the Gurjara Pratiharas carry a genetic signature that set them apart? And if they did, where did it go? We often talk about unique DNA, like it's a crown, a biological stamp that says, this group was different, special, elite. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? What if the Gurjara Pratiharas weren't genetically unique because of what they carried, but because of how that legacy was formed? Let's clear something up right now. There's no such thing as a royal gene. No sequence in your DNA glows brighter if your ancestors wore a crown. So when we ask whether the Gurjara Pratiharas had unique DNA, we're not looking for a single magical marker. We're looking for a pattern, a mosaic of traits, a trail of historical decisions etched into chromosomes over generations. And that trail, it's messy, chaotic, beautifully complicated. Think of the Gurjara Pratiharas not as a sealed genetic vault, but as a genetic junction point where migrations collided, castes recalibrated, cultures merged. The real uniqueness isn't in isolation, it's in synthesis. Take this for example. Rajputs today, particularly those in Rajasthan, often show a strong component of Zagrossian ancestry. That's ancient West Asian blood, traced back to early agricultural societies near modern-day Iran. Now match that with some Gurjar populations, especially those in Jammu, who show even higher Zagrossian percentages. That's not coincidence. That's shared history, not shared by conquest, but by coalescence, by warrior clans and pastoral tribes merging under one banner, by dynasties absorbing the strength of newcomers and reshaping them through myth, marriage, and ritual. That kind of genetic blend isn't accidental. It's strategic, it's political, and it's rare, because most empires, especially those built quickly, leave behind fractured legacies, broken lines, forgotten names. But here's the twist. Even today, Gurjars and Rajputs in different regions carry echoes of the same ancestral components, not always identical, but undeniably related. They may speak different dialects now, follow different customs, belong to different castes, but somewhere in the bloodstream, that old fire still flickers. So is this uniqueness. Yes, but not in the way popular media would make you believe. It's not about superiority. It's about survival through adaptation. It's the kind of uniqueness that forms when a group refuses to be defined by a single ethnicity or a fixed homeland. When people don't just migrate, they reinvent. When power isn't inherited by blood alone, but crafted through alliances, assimilation, and carefully curated identity. Ask yourself this. What's more powerful? A bloodline that never mixed, or one that took the best of everything it encountered and turned it into something new? That's what the Gurjara Pratiharas might represent. A living blueprint for how complexity creates resilience. How empires don't just defend borders, they forge identities strong enough to echo through genetic code 1,000 years later. So no, the DNA wasn't exclusive. It was inclusive. And maybe that's why it survived. So here we are, at the edge of a mystery that began over 1,000 years ago. An empire that rose fast, ruled long, and disappeared without a whisper. No surviving palaces. No royal tombs. No confirmed bloodlines. And yet it never truly vanished. Because the story of the Gurjara Pratiharas isn't buried in the ground. It's walking all around us. In the faces we pass every day. In the surnames we hear without noticing. In the unseen signatures written into the double helix of our very selves. But how do you measure a dynasty when it leaves no crown behind? You look at the data. You trace the genetic breadcrumbs. And what you find is a community, or perhaps a network of communities, that carry the silent inheritance of empire. Modern Gujjars, Rajputs, pastoral nomads, northern warriors, in isolated valleys of Jammu and sprawling deserts of Rajasthan, in the highlands of Afghanistan and plains of western Uttar Pradesh. You find echoes, not in titles, not in myths, but in shared alleles, unique haplogroup concentrations, rare mitochondrial variants that repeat just often enough to make you pause, patterns too precise to be chance, but too complex to be conclusive. And maybe that's the point, because the legacy of the Gurjara Pratiharas isn't just genetic. It's cultural, political, psychological. It's in how a group with no clear starting point claimed center stage. It's in how they wrote themselves into India's mythos, not as invaders, but as protectors, as warriors who stood between India and the advancing armies of the West. And now, it's in how we remember them, or don't. Why do school books barely mention them? Why are we taught about the Mughals, the Mauryas, the Guptas, but not the Gurjaras who held the line when the Arab world pushed into Sindh? When did we decide their story wasn't worth telling? Maybe because their legacy isn't easy to box in. Maybe because their descendants don't wear royal robes. They herd cattle. They farm fields. They live ordinary lives. But behind those lives, hidden in chromosomes and family names, is a memory that refuses to die. And this brings us to a quiet, powerful truth. You don't need ancient ruins to prove a dynasty existed. Sometimes the most enduring empires are the ones that continue inside us. So ask yourself, if you took a DNA test today, what would it say about your past? Would it speak of rulers or rebels? Of merchants or migrants? Would it whisper the name of a forgotten king? Or maybe, just maybe, it would tell you something even greater, that you are part of a story so old, even history books missed it.